Histories of gendered and racial atrocities. Throughout human history, women have often borne the deepest scars of societal cruelty. From the flames of Sati that consumed widows in the name of false honor, to the silent graves of infant girls denied the right to live, barbaric practices have long reflected the moral decay of civilizations that failed to value womanhood. The degradation did not end with geography or time. It crossed continents and centuries, manifesting in the enslavement and humiliation of African American women, whose bodies and dignity were exploited under racial and patriarchal oppression alike. These inhuman customs, rooted in ignorance and power, reveal a universal pattern of subjugation that sought to suppress the very source of life itself, the woman. Understanding these historical injustices is not merely an act of remembrance, it is a necessary step toward reclaiming truth and affirming the inherent worth and equality of women across all cultures and eras. These historical atrocities can be examined through four major examples: the practice of Sati, female infanticide, caste and gender-based discrimination, and the racial exploitation of African women. A. Sati. Sati or Suti refers to a historical and now prohibited practice in which a Hindu widow was burned alive on her deceased husband's funeral pyre. This act, whether entered into voluntarily, through coercion, or under social compulsion, reflected the patriarchal perception that a woman's life held value only in relation to her husband. The practice symbolized devotion, but in reality, emerged from societal norms that offered widows little or no space to live independently. In India, Sati was among the most severe expressions of gender inequality. As observed by Larry S. Milner, while many religious or superstitious observances were openly practiced, such as widows throwing themselves on a burning funeral pyre of their husbands in the deadly ritual known as Sati. Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, 240. The act of a Hindu widow immolating herself on her husband's pyre represented many meanings. According to Mariam Schooler Ocock and Murad M. Khan, Sati was a form of dying by suicide, which was fairly common in North India in particular, until the British rulers made it an illegal act. They further explain that the act might have been the result of devotion or coercion, since caring for widows was considered a burden on the family. Mariam Schooler Ocock and Murad M. Khan, Suicide Across Cultures. Understanding the variation and complexity of the suicidal process across ethnicities and cultures. Oxford University Press, 2024-20. Historical accounts from the late 16th century describe the cruel fate of widows who refused Sati. Ralph Fitch, an English traveler, recorded that, when the husband died, his wife is burned with him. If she be alive, if she will not, her head is shaven, and then is never any account made of her after. J. Horton Riley, Ralph Fitch, London T. Fisher and Irwin, 1899, 60. The medieval scholar Al-Biruni, in his Record of Indian Customs, described Sati with unsettling matter-of-factness. When the husband dies, the widow has to burn herself, or else she has to remain a widow as long as she lives, and to live with him, the deceased husband, in the other world. Al-Biruni, Muhammad ibn Ahmed, Al-Biruni's India, translated by E.C. Sachow, London, Trubner & Co., Keegan Paul, Trench, Trubner & Co., Louis Delit, Chapter Ellen Nikes, Bijah 155. In Pakistan, François Bernier, 1620-1688, documented an appalling incident he witnessed at Lahore. At Lahore, I saw a most beautiful young widow sacrificed, who could not, I think, have been more than 12 years of age. The poor little creature appeared more dead than alive when she approached the dreadful pit. The innocent creature was burnt alive. This account captures the inhuman coercion often disguised as religious obligation. François Bernier, Travels in the Mughal Empire, AD 1656-1668, Paris, 1670. In Nepal, the earliest known inscription referring to Sati dates to the 5th century. It records a king persuading his mother not to commit Sati after his father's death, suggesting that while the practice existed, it was not compulsory. John Whelpton, A History of Nepal, Cambridge University Press, 2005. 19. Further evidence of its existence is found in the inscriptions compiled by Dr. Regmi. The Kingdom of Nepal officially banned Sati in 1920, marking an important step toward reforming women's rights. Dr. Regmi, Inscriptions of Ancient Nepal, New Delhi, Motilal Banarsidass, 1983. 11. Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Violations in Nepal, New York, Human Rights Watch, 1989. 14. In Indonesia, particularly on the island of Bali, the practice locally known as masatya was prevalent among the aristocracy until the early 20th century. The Dutch colonial authorities compelled local rulers to abolish it through treaties signed in 1903, as noted by Merle Calvin Ricklefs in A History of Modern Indonesia since c. 1300, London, Macmillan, 1991. A similar observation is made by Margaret J. Weiner, who discusses the ritual and its suppression in visible and invisible realms, power, magic, and colonial conquest in Bali, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1995, 2:67-68. Historical accounts reveal that only royal widows were permitted to die by burning, while concubines or women of lower rank were stabbed to death before being burned. Helen Creese, Women of the Kakawin World, Marriage and Sexuality in the Indic Courts of Java and Bali, Armonk, N.Y. M. E. Sharp, 2005, 240-241. In Myanmar, similar traditions were observed. One record notes that, at death, the nobles and Brahmins of the city are burned on a pyre, and their ashes are preserved in special earthen urns. 15 days after the death of her husband, the widow commits sati. This description refers to the ancient city of Mergui, modern Miek, located in southern Myanmar. Donald F. Locke, Asia in the Making of Europe, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1965, 525. In Bangladesh, the practice existed as early as the 12th century. Anand A. Yang notes that it began among the Kshatriya caste before spreading to others, including Brahmins. Anand A. Yang, Who's Sati, widow burning in early 19th century India. A similar observation is made in Women and Social Reform in Modern India. A reader, Edir, Sumit Sarkar and Tanika Sarkar, Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 2008, 22. Julia Leslie writes that the custom increased among Bengali Brahmins between 1680 and 1830 after widows gained inheritance rights. Julia Leslie, Suti or Sati, victim or victor. A similar observation is made in Institutions and Ideologies, a SOAS South Asia reader, Edi. David Arnold and Peter Robb, London Routledge, 1993, 43. During the colonial period, Uma Narayan observes, Sati experienced a revival, particularly in Bengal, as patriarchal society reacted to women's changing roles and property rights. Uma Narayan, Dislocating Cultures, Identities, Traditions, and Third World Feminism, New York Routledge, 1997, 59-65. In Vietnam, early 14th century traveler Odoric of Pordenone recorded the burning of wives in Zampa, modern Champa, confirming the presence of widow immolation in Southeast Asia. Kim M. Phillips, Before Orientalism, Asian Peoples and Cultures in European Travel Writing, 1245-1510, Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2013, 119. In Cambodia, records show that both the lords and the wives of deceased kings burned themselves voluntarily during the 15th and 16th centuries. Georges Quades reached this conclusion through inscriptions, which are supported by references in Hobson Jobson, the definitive glossary of British India. Manesh K. Sharon, Studies in Sanskrit, Inscriptions of Ancient Cambodia, New Delhi, Abhinav Publications, 2003, 192. A similar observation is made by Henry Ewell and A.C. Burnell. Hobson Jobson, The Definitive Glossary of British India. London, John Murray, 2013, 495. Final thoughts. Sati stands as one of history's most tragic illustrations of how women's identities were confined within patriarchal and religious boundaries. While presented as an act of devotion or spiritual loyalty, the practice reflected the systemic devaluation of women's lives. Across regions from India to Nepal, Indonesia, and beyond, Sati became a ritual of oppression cloaked in sanctity. Its endurance for centuries underscores not faith, but the fear of a society unwilling to envision womanhood beyond dependence and sacrifice. B. Female infanticide. Female infanticide, the deliberate killing of newborn girls, has existed in many civilizations throughout history, rooted in patriarchy, poverty, and the devaluation of women. In societies where daughters were seen as economic burdens and sons as bearers of lineage and honor, this act became tragically normalized. The practice, found in Arabia, Persia, Greece, Rome, India, and China, reveals how cultural prejudice and social fear often outweighed compassion. Beyond its physical violence, female infanticide symbolized the moral collapse of societies that failed to recognize the equal worth of all human life.
In pre-Islamic Arabia, the practice of Wad al-Banat, the burial of infant girls alive, was a grim reality. It arose from fear of poverty, hunger, and the supposed shame of having daughters. R.A. Nicholson notes that the system which prevailed in the Jahiliyya of burying female infants alive, revolting as it appears to us, was due partly to the frequent famines with which Arabia is afflicted through lack of rain, and partly to a perverted sense of humor. R.A. Nicholson, A Literary History of the Arabs, Cambridge. Cambridge University Press, 1966, 90.
The Quran acknowledged and condemned this in powerful terms, and when the girl who was buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed, Quran 81, 8-9. Scholars affirm that this was not merely a myth but an established social practice, as evidenced by numerous historical accounts and widespread occurrences. Its prevalence necessitated explicit condemnation in the Quran, indicating that it was indeed practiced and often employed as a means to regulate family honor and ensure social survival. As one modern study observes, the putative practice of female infanticide has long been assumed, but textual, archaeological, and historiographical evidence reveals its role as an instrument of patriarchal control, rooted in fear of dishonor and poverty. The Quran and the putative pre-Islamic practice of female infanticide, 1-3. Larry S. Milner writes that female infanticide was a common practice throughout Arabia before the time of Muhammad. Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, 227.
Aziza al-Hibri further explains that some Arabs, like Sa'id bin Najiyah and Zayd ibn Amr bin Nufail, would try to save infant girls by purchasing them from their fathers. To prevent their burial. Aziza al-Hibri, A Study of Islamic History, or How Did We Ever Get Into This Mess? Women's Studies. International Forum, Oxford, Pergamon Press, 1982, 209.
A painful account appears in W. Robertson Smith's Kinship and Marriage in Early Arabia, Cambridge University Press, 1885, where a man named Kais confessed, "I led her out one day and dug a grave and laid her in it, she crying, 'Father, what are you doing with me?' Then I covered her up with earth till I could hear her cries no longer. And that is the only time I felt pity, when I buried a daughter." Similarly, Sunan al-Darimi records, "We would worship idols in the pre-Islamic era and kill our daughters. I had a daughter who would rejoice whenever she saw me. One day I called her, and when we reached a well, I threw her in. The last thing I heard was her cry, 'Oh father, oh father.'" Sunan al-Darimi, Hadith number 2. In ancient Persia, a patriarchal society shaped by male dominance, daughters were often considered financial burdens. A Persian proverb even called it a generous deed to bury a female child. Milner records that it was not unusual for unwanted daughters to be buried alive, and girls even after the age of 6 years were occasionally sacrificed. Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, 227. This cruel custom mirrored a world where a girl's existence was weighed against notions of honor and expense. In ancient Greece, the father held absolute power over the life of his child. Many daughters were abandoned, denied nourishment, or left to die. Milner notes that fathers often exposed newborn daughters before they were accepted into the family. Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, 226. Historian Mark Golden observed that Greek society allowed this practice to persist, partly to avoid an excess of widows later in life, revealing how gender imbalance was justified through social reasoning rather than compassion.
In Rome, the exposure of female infants was common and accepted. The saying, "Everyone raises a son, even a poor man, but even a rich man will abandon a daughter," reveals the underlying mindset. Reflecting the social indifference toward female suffering, John Boswell describes how literary and philosophical sources reflect this normalized cruelty, noting that even in Roman plays, fathers exposed daughters without remorse. The kindness of strangers. The abandonment of children in Western Europe from late antiquity to the Renaissance. Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1988, 102.
India. In India, the roots of female infanticide lay in the dowry system and rigid caste boundaries. Milner explains that extravagant dowries have been postulated as the primary cause of the extensive acceptance of female infanticide. Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, 241. Among the Rajputs, when a daughter's marriage was deemed impossible or unaffordable, her life was often ended shortly after birth. Methods included poisoning, suffocating with cow dung, or drowning in milk. Chroniclers like Farishta observed that among the Ghakkars of Punjab, a female child would be lifted to the doorway and proclaimed to any man who wanted a wife. If none stepped forward, she was put to death immediately. This chilling ritual reflected the complete subjugation of women to social and economic forces. In ancient China, son preference became deeply ingrained within family systems. The poet Po Chui lamented, "If I am spared the grief of her dying young, then I shall have the trouble of getting her married." Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, 237. Han Fei Tzu wrote, "When a boy is born, the parents congratulate one another. When a girl is born, they put it to death." During the Sung dynasty, female infanticide became common practice, and newborn girls were often drowned in cold water and called water babies. This tragic act, widespread in regions such as Fujian and Jiangxi, was justified by poverty, but driven by the ingrained devaluation of women. Final thoughts. Across continents and centuries, the killing of female infants exposes a universal wound, the denial of a woman's right to exist. While each culture justified it through poverty, shame, or social order, the underlying truth was the same. Women were considered expendable in the pursuit of patriarchal control. To confront this history is to confront the collective conscience of humanity, and to recognize that progress begins when life, regardless of gender, is valued equally. C. Caste and gender-based humiliation of women. Throughout ancient civilizations, the subjugation and humiliation of women were codified in law, sanctified by religion, and perpetuated through custom. Across India, China, Europe, and Mesopotamia, patriarchal systems institutionalized the belief that women were inferior beings, bound by obedience, and defined only by their relationship to men. These social orders not only limited women's autonomy, but also constructed moral and legal frameworks that justified their suffering as natural or divinely ordained. In ancient India, women were systematically subordinated through religious and legal codes that denied them independence and dignity. The Manusmriti, a foundational Hindu text, explicitly reinforced this subservience. By a girl, by a young woman, or even by an aged one, nothing must be done independently, even in her own house.
Manusmriti, G. Bulla, Volume 25, Chapter 9, Verse 3.
This passage reveals how the Manusmriti institutionalized female dependence on male authority, first the father, then the husband, and finally the son. The same text also entrenched caste and gender hierarchies by condemning unions between higher caste men and lower caste women. The Shudra, belonging to the lowest of the four Varnas, were considered inherently servile. The scripture warned, "A Brahmana who takes a Sudra wife to his bed will, after death, sink into hell." If he begets a child by her, he will lose the rank of a Brahmana. Manusmriti, Echelon III, verses 17 through 19. It further declared that the gods would reject offerings made with the aid of a Sudra wife, branding such unions as spiritually defiling. These verses reflect how both caste and gender converge to degrade women, especially those of lower social standing, reducing them to objects of pollution rather than partners in spiritual or moral life. In China, the subordination of women was codified through moral principles known as the Three Obediences, which required a woman to obey her father in youth, her husband in adulthood, and her son in old age. Larry S. Milner observes that women were not able to offer ancestral sacrifice, glorify the family name through official appointments, or even perpetuate the family name since they took on the aura of their husband's family. Larry S. Milner, Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, The Stain of Human Infanticide. Lanham, University Press of America, 2000, 237. Such doctrines erased female identity and autonomy, rendering women perpetual dependents within the Confucian family structure. Their social existence was measured solely through service to male relatives, and their virtue was defined by submission. In Europe, in medieval and early modern Europe, theology provided the intellectual foundation for women's humiliation. The notorious Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, written by Heinrich Kramer, served as a judicial guide for witch trials and embodied the era's deep misogyny. It declared, "She is more carnal than a man, and since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives." Heinrich Kramer, The Malleus Maleficarum, Speyer, 1486-44. This text portrayed women as morally and physically flawed beings, inherently inclined toward sin and deceit. Its doctrines justified the persecution of countless women accused of witchcraft, rationalizing torture and execution as divine justice. Through such works, misogyny was not merely tolerated but canonized, transforming spiritual dogma into a mechanism of terror. In ancient Mesopotamia, women's subjugation was legally enshrined in the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest codifications of law. It stated, "If a woman has been caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. If the finger has been pointed at a man's wife because of another man, but she has not been caught lying with the other man, she shall leap into the river for her husband's sake." The Code of Hammurabi, Ed. R. F. Harper, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1904, paragraph 131-132. Here, even suspicion was sufficient to condemn a woman to death by drowning. Her body became a site of punishment, and her virtue, a commodity policed by men. Female sexuality was criminalized, and honor was preserved only through the annihilation of women's autonomy. Final thoughts. Across millennia and civilizations, women's humiliation has been sanctified through religion, law, and war. Whether through the decrees of the Manus Martii, the Three Obediences of China, the theology of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the edicts of the Code of Hammurabi, women were cast as dependent, defective, or dangerous. The persistence of such narratives reveals that the struggle for gender equality is not merely social, but deeply historical, a confrontation with centuries of normalized injustice that defined half of humanity as less than whole. D. Sexual and reproductive exploitation of African American women. The history of African American women in the United States is deeply intertwined with cycles of coercion, exploitation, and systemic neglect, especially in matters of sexuality and reproduction. The data presented in the table highlights not just isolated events, but an unbroken continuum of violence, discrimination, and denial of bodily autonomy that spans 4 centuries. Slavery, 1619 to 1865. During slavery, the female body was treated as both labor and property. Women were displayed naked in public auctions where their reproductive ability was openly examined to determine economic worth. They were raped for both sexual gratification and economic gain, with pregnancies often forced or terminated depending on the master's convenience. This period gave rise to dehumanizing stereotypes, such as the Jezebel myth, which portrayed black women as hypersexual beings. Healthcare practices mirrored this brutality. Enslaved women were subjected to non-consensual gynecological surgeries and experimental procedures, often without anesthesia, in order to refine techniques for broader medical use. Black Codes and Jim Crow, 1865-1965. Even after emancipation, freedom did not mean safety. Under Jim Crow laws, black women continued to endure systemic violence, rape, lynching that sometimes included genital mutilation, and widespread poverty. Access to health care was almost non-existent, and where it existed, it often came with coercive strings attached, such as forced sterilization. Medical exploitation remained a chilling reality, most infamously reflected in experiments like those connected to the Tuskegee syphilis study. Generational poverty reinforced their vulnerability, while racist stereotypes persisted and were amplified through negative portrayals in media. Civil Rights Era, 1955-1975. The Civil Rights Movement promised equality, but for African American women the struggle persisted. They continued to face sexual violence, often used as a weapon of control to assert white supremacy. The fight for civil rights also exposed the unequal legal protections they received. Meanwhile, media outlets reinforced damaging caricatures, portraying black women as excessively sexual and thereby justifying continued exploitation. Healthcare remained discriminatory, with women still subjected to coerced medical procedures and deprived of equal access to services. Post-Civil Rights Era, 1975-2018. Despite legal progress, the scars of history were carried forward. The rise of mass media created new battlegrounds for representation, with blaxploitation films and hypersexualized portrayals of black women embedding old stereotypes in modern culture. Structural inequalities in healthcare also remained persistent. Targeted sterilizations, high rates of hysterectomies, and unequal access to reproductive health care continued to disproportionately affect African American women. Poverty, rooted in centuries of systemic denial, persisted as a generational burden. Final thoughts. A 4-century continuum, from slavery to the present day, reveals a striking truth about the experiences of African American women. Control over their bodies was seldom their own. The forms of exploitation evolved over time: slave auctions, forced sterilizations, medical experiments, and dehumanizing stereotypes. But the essence remained unchanged. Their reproductive autonomy was systematically denied. Healthcare systems, rather than serving as a refuge, often became an extension of oppression. Source: Racism, African American Women and Their Sexual and Reproductive Health. A review of historical and contemporary evidence and implications for health equity. Cynthia Prather, Talaria R. Fuller, William L. Jeffries,